Tonight's Shiur in Siman Yud, we are up to Sif Yud Alef. It's the last word on page 36. The Mechaber says in Sif Yud Alef, Sudar shenosnen al hatzavar b'malchus Eretz Yisrael. Some kind of scarf that they would wear around their necks in the malchus of Eretz Yisrael. Shenikra ba'arvi shid. It's called an arvi shid. V'chein buka shayonosnen b'sfarad al kisveihem. And so to the buka that they would wear in Sfarad on their shoulders, peturin. These garments are potter from Tzitzis. Mishna Berura begins on page Yotes of Kotan Lamedalu de peturin. Av shehem machzik oso hachaticha ka'ama o amasayim. Even though this scarf or this garment is really the proper size that's normally chayiv in tzitzis, v'yesh kedei lechasos rosho v'rubo shel katan. There is the amount that can cover the head and majority of the body of a katan, as we'll see. That's the shiur that's chayiv in tzitzis. Afilu hachi peturim. Still there are pater v'ayim b'bir halacha. Look in the bir halacha where it'll explain why. So if you look in the bir halacha, back on page 36 at the bottom, he writes, Sudur shenosim peturim, ayim b'Mishna Berura, ve'atam lazeh kosa b'Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef writes the reason why these garments are potter from tzitzis, she'ikar havos hasudorim ahem mitchila, hu kedei l'his'atif b'hem sevivos harosh mipnei hakor. Because the reason why they originally bring these sudarim is in order to wrap themselves, to wrap it around their heads when it's cold, velasos tzel al harosh bizman hachom, and to be using it for shade on their heads when it's hot outside. So it's really being used for the head. The gam lechasos b'harosh be'achatichos habeged be'eshu ola likra b'Torah. Also, they use it to cover their heads at the time when they get called up to the Torah. V'lochein, and therefore says the Ber Halacha, Afshe rov hayom hu mevia al haguf. Even though most of the day this garment is in fact worn around their bodies, shuv havelek sus rosh upater. This is considered a head garment and it is pater. Since it's originally brought to be protecting the head, it's a head garment, and as we said already a few times, a head garment is pater from tzitzis. V'odye shlomer, another reason the Bir Halacha brings down, she'ikar havos hasudarim ahem hu lehishtamish behem lekam dvarim. The reason again why they bring these sudarim is for various uses. For example, lachgor behem kishaosim shum avodas masa, to wrap it around themselves like a belt at the time when they're doing heavy loads, or lekaneach behem as yadayim, where they use it to wipe their hands, v'litzror behemos, or to wrap money in, ulahavi behem peros, to bring fruit in it, ulakaneach hazeh, to wipe their sweat. So it's brought for all these other purposes. And even though it's true they use it for protection from the heat in the heat and from the rain in the rain, since it wasn't brought mitchila for this purpose, lo chashiva, it is not chashiv, v'lo karinan asher techaseba. We don't call upon it asher techaseba, which is the pasuk that tells us the chi of tzitzis. And therefore, those are the explanations of why these garments are not chayiv in tzitzis, either because it's really a head garment, or because it's used for other uses be'ikr, and it happens to be also sometimes used to protect the body. Let's go weiter in the Mechaber Sif Yud Beis. Malbushim shebe Mitzrayim. Now, these garments that were worn in Mitzrayim, hanekroim guchash v'chein mintigi v'dulmanish v'kaptanish upidinish shebe sugarma. So all these nice garments, alfa pi sheyesh lehem daled knafim, even though they have four corners, they are peturim. We will not explain what all the garments are, but we'll see in the Mishna Berura a general explanation of what they are and why they're pater. But let's first see the Ramah. The Ramah says, "V'hu hadin malbushim shel galilos b'nei Ashkenaz u'Sfarad." Also the garments in the areas of Ashkenaz and Sfarad. Hoel v'ein kanfeim asuyim sheyu shnayim lifneim u'shnayim la'achareim muchuvanim zo keneged zo peturim. Since they are not made with two strings in front and two strings in the back across from each other, they are pater. So we'll see that the corners are not directly across from each other in the front and the back, and therefore they're pater. So let's see the Mishna Berura. We'll explain the Mechaber, we'll explain the Ramah. So the Mishna Berura begins in Sifkatan Lamed Hey, Afal Pi Sheyesh Lahem. This is going in the garments the Mechaber is discussing. And he says in the Mechaber, Afal Pi Sheyesh Lahem Dalet Knafim, they are peturim, says the Mishna Berura, Hatam Ayin Beis Yosef. The reason, look in the Beis Yosef. Now I'm going to explain what the Beis Yosef says. That really applies in the next Mishna Berura as well. The Beis Yosef brings down two reasons why these garments are pater. Number one, these garments were only worn mipnei ha'kavod, and they were not worn to protect you from the cold or from the heat. They're only there for kavod, and therefore they're not chayiv in tzitzis. Number two, he says these garments were very long, and if you would put tzitzis on the bottom corners, which are very long, and they were dragging on the floor, so they would constantly rip and they would have to be replaced, and that's not the Noam. The Torah never requires you to do something that's not pleasant, to have your tzitzis ripping every other day and having to replace them. That's unpleasant. Now the Ramah, as we'll see quoted here, disagrees with both of these pshatim in the Mechaber, in the Beis Yosef. And he says, number one, in terms of the first thing, that the Mechaber said the reason why it's pater is only b'nei ha'kavod. He says, what about our talesim? We're not wearing our talesim to protect ourselves from the cold, right? Unless the heat's broken in the Beis Medrash. Our talesim are there for the mitzvah, for tefillah, for the mitzvah tzitzis. They're not there as a real garment to protect us. So if you're going to say that's the reason why those garments are pater, so why are our talesim chayiv? And in terms of the second question, he brings a raya from the Gemara in Gittin that talks about the Churban. There was a person named Ben Tzitzis HaKesas. He used to wear very long tzitzis that would drag on the floor. So again, the mashmos over there is that he was wearing tzitzis. He was makayim the mitzvah tzitzis that were dragging on the floor, according to the Mechaber, according to the Beis Yosef. So if they're dragging on the floor, that garment would not be chayiv in tzitzis at all. And therefore, the Darchei Moshe, who is the Ramah, disagrees with the Beis Yosef, who is the Mechaber, who gives those two reasons, and therefore the Ramah brings his own reason. Now I'm going to speak out the Ramah's reason, and we'll reference it in the next Mishna Berura as well, and that is based on a very interesting Yalkut Shimoni, especially as we're heading into Nisan. The Yalkut Shimoni says that when Klal Yisrael went into the Yamsuf, when the Yamsuf split and Klal Yisrael went in, the Malach Gavriel went in, and the Malach Gavriel was warning the water not to attack Klal Yisrael. Because it says, V'amayin lahem choma. So some say the drasha is that it was chema, that it was angry and it wanted to attack Klal Yisrael. And the Malach Gavriel said to the water that was on the right side, don't start up with Klal Yisrael that's going to receive the Torah from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's right hand. He said to the water that was on the left side, don't start up with Klal Yisrael, they're going to be wearing tefillin on their left hand. The water in front of them, the Malach Gavriel said, don't start up with Klal Yisrael, because they're going to have the bris milah in front of them. And the water that was behind them, the Malach Gavriel said, don't start up with them, the kesher shel tefillin will be behind them, and they'll have tzitzis behind them. And as we're going to see, the Ramah is going to explain, and this is Darchei Moshe brings down this medrash, that tzitzis are not chayiv unless they are two corners in front, like we saw the Ramah says, and two corners in the back. And these garments that we're describing over here are some kind of jackets or sweaters that have four corners, two on top, two on the bottom, but they're all in the front. And therefore, since the measure says that the Malach Gavriel says to the water behind them, don't attack, because Klal Yisrael is going to have thrown two corners behind them, so you learn from that measure, so you have to have two corners in the front, two corners in the back. That is how the Ramah explains why these garments are pater. We'll see others argue and say you can't bring a raya from the drashim for what the halacha is. But let's see now with that introduction, the Mishna Berura in Sivkatan Lamed Vav Hoel Ve'ein. This is going to the Ramah that said you're not chayiv because you don't have, again, it's not set up with the garment with two corners in the front and two corners in the back, muchuvan, like across from each other. Says the Mishna Berura, the Hinei Beis Yosef Kasa, the Beis Yosef writes, Yesh ledakdek b'malbushim shalanu. We have to analyze our garments that have two corners close to the neck on top, and they have two corners close to the bottom. Why don't we put tzitzis on them? And the Beis Yosef brings a few answers. We mentioned two of them. Two of them again were that they're not worn because of the cold and the heat, they're worn because of kavod. And the other answer is that the tzitzis on the bottom would be very low down, it's a long garment, and they would drag on the floor, and that's not the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu would command us in the mitzvah. V'docha osam Darchei Moshe, as we just spoke out, the Darchei Moshe pushes off those two pshatim. V'amar hu tam lamin. He brings his own reason, and that's based on the medrash that we just spoke out on the Yalkut Shimoni. The me'achar the mitzvahs tzitzis hu lachatchila sheyachshir shtayim lefanav v'shtayim la'acharav. Since the mitzvah tzitzis that we just spoke out is with two corners in the front, two corners in the back, u'malbushim shalonu heim kol ha'arba knafos lefanav. And these garments that we're discussing here have all four corners in the front, two on top, two on the bottom. Just picture a jacket, corners on the bottom, corners on the top over here, and that's why they are going to be pater according to the Ramah. So therefore, ein chayavim b'tzitzis. V'zeu mashakasav. That's what the Ramah means over here when he says, "Hoel v'ein kanfeim asuyim." As the Ramah says, since the corners are not made, two in the front, two in the back, that's the reason why these garments are pater. Umalbush shekoren rok. A malbush, a garment that's called a rok, which a targum on the bottom says in number 1, a me'il, some kind of coat. Shemechuber l'malo chatichas beged merubas. That there is attached to it on top some kind of piece of material that's square. Umunach al kesefo ma'achorov, and it's placed on the back of the garment. Shekorin kolner, which is like a collar. Posher hu de pater. It's obvious that such a garment is pater. Sharei letzadmala ein lo knafos. On top there are no corners. Rak kanfos hakalner, just the corners of this collar. Hamunochin lo tzas me'achorov. Whatever this garment looked like, it was some kind of coat, but it had some kind of collar in the back, and the corners on top were facing somewhat towards the back. Ve'ein ze kronos, that's not called corners, that's chayiv. Hoel ve'ein ashnei kronos sheme'achorov mechuvanos neged ha'knafo shelefanov. Ad kan l'shon Darchei Moshe. So Darchei Moshe explains this garment called the rok, it has two corners on the top towards the back, and two corners in the front all the way in the bottom. But again, like the Ramah says, not mechuvan. What?
Probably a cape. Yeah.
Well, but the corners on the top were a little bit in the back, and on the bottom were in the front. Yeah, okay, it's not clear exactly. Whatever it was, the point is that the corners in the back and the front were not mechuvan. Two were up here, and two were down below, so that's why it's pater. The Kosav HaMagen Avraham, the Magen Avraham writes, Yan sha'alocha zu rofefes biyad ha'gaonim. Since this halacha is weak in the hands of the Gaonim, v'lo motzu tam nochum, they didn't find really a good reason. Ki gam al tam Darchei Moshe yesh lefakvek harbek. He's even the reason of Darchei Moshe, like we mentioned before, who brought down from the measures the Yalkut Shimoni. There's what to take issue with. Kimoshe Kasa Pri Megadim. Don't bring me rayas from what the Malach Gavriel says. We don't learn halacha from what Malach Gavriel says in the measures. Al Kain. Therefore, Yirei Shamayim Yasek Keren Achas Agula. One who is Yirei Shamayim will make one of the corners rounded. Kimoshe Kasa Beis Yosef B'Shem HaZakenim. V'chein Das Pri Megadim U'Shari Achronim. Since it's very not pashut, why and if it's such a garment that you have a suffix about, either you have all four corners in the front, or you have the two in the back high up and two in the front low down, it's best to avoid it and to round one of the corners so there's absolutely no suffix. It's pater from tzitzis. Ubeprapi amenu, certainly in our days, ba'osana begodim shenogu meichadash la'asosan pasuach me'acharehem. Certainly in our days where we have garments that they're made open in the back. V'hu ha'beged ha'nikra kapoteh. This is talking about a kapota, and in the Targum in number 3 he says a beged elyon, a frak. So you wear a kapota, a frak, a long coat, so we know it's split in the back. Or some of our a coat that someone wears, a nice wool coat, so in the back there's a slit in the back, so it's open in the back. Motsuihu kama pa'amim sheruba pasuach. As we've been learning the last few days, whenever there's a slit, in order to be chayav and tzitzis, it has to be open most of the way up. So let's say it is open most of the way up. Now it's going to be chayiv and tzitzis. Ulefi divrei Darchei Moshe chayiv b'tzitzis. According to Darchei Moshe, we've been discussing that it has to be two in the front, two in the back, mechuvan across from each other. This frak would be chayiv if it's cut most of the way up. Sharei shtei knafos shel ha'achrav mechuvanos keneged shtei knafos shel ha'fanov. That's exactly what this is. The front of the garment on the bottom has two corners, and now the back with the slit most of the way up has another two corners. Now you have four corners, two in the front, two in the back, mechuvan towards each other. That would be chayiv and tzitzis. Al kain harotze liftor atzmo, someone who wants to wear a frak like this and doesn't want to be having tzitzis on it. Mechuyav laso sham al kol panim keren achas me'osan arba knafos agula. He has to make one of those four corners on the bottom rounded. V'ti pater min tzitzis, and then the garment will not be chayiv and tzitzis. Ukid la'el b'siftes, like we learned earlier in siftes. V'ayin sham v'halacha. And then he says, V'yoser tov sheya'agel od shtei kronos. Really, it's best to not only round one corner, to round two more corners, to really round three corners altogether. Kedei shetishoy rak ba'shalosh. So it should remain with only three corners, ki ata hi ba'shisha. Because really the garment has six corners. We've been discussing the four on the bottom, two in the front, two in the back, but there's also two more on the top. And therefore it's really six. So for the 4 on the bottom, so the simplest way, Lefi the Ramah, you're only chayav because of those 4, 2 in the front, 2 in the back, that are mechuven connected each other. So rounding 1 is enough. But according to any other shitas that maybe doesn't need a mechuven and they could all be in the front, so you want to really round 3 corners to make sure altogether this 6-cornered garment will only really have 3 corners, and then you really avoid all svekis. Continues the Mishna Berura Vaitis if Katan Lamid Zayin. Ushnayim la'achareim. Again, this is going on the Ramah that says that our malbushim, that the corners are not made 2 in the front, 2 in the back, mechuven connected each other, the pturim. Mizeh losha nimsha shkaga le'iza noshim. Because of this language of the Ramah, some people have come to make a mistake. Shemikaplin mechelek echad me'atalus ma'od. So they want to make sure that the strings are mechuven connected each other. Well, when you wear a talus and you put it over your front and they're pretty high up, and the ones in the back are low, so they're not really so mechuven connected each other. So what do? They fold up the back of the garment. They fold it up a lot until it becomes like very compact on the top. And now it turns out that they have their talus really just covering the neck. It's rolled up all the way up their bodies to cover the neck because they want to make sure that the strings in the front, the corners in the front, the corners in the back are across from each other exactly. Their kavanah is that the strings in the back, the tzitzis in the back, should mamish be on their shoulders. However, that's not really the best way to do it. Once again, then you have a covering of your head or your neck. It's not a covering of your body. We want the garment to be covering your body, so you're trying to gain in one area by making the 4 tzitzis mechuven, the 2 in the front, 2 in the back, mechuven towards each other. But now you're really making it into a head covering and not a body covering. V'yoser tov k'minagat togarmin. Really, the best is to do like the Turkish, the torgamin, which we had that lashon in the Mechaber as well. Shahayod mafsekes bechatzi hatalus, that the hand should be separating the 2 halves of the talus, ba'ofen in a way shemishnei atzadim yeh echad me'atzitzis lefonav v'chelek la'acharav. Like we wear our talus, we have our arm in between the part that's in the front and the part that's in the back. If it's in front and the back, a little to the side, like it ends up being, that's also okay. Therefore, it would be enough to have a hefsek hayad. This is the way the picture books show it. It's still like the way we wear talus, that we have our arms separating between the part in the front and part of the back. But really what's interesting and what comes out l'chora lefi the Ramah here is that as opposed to what some people do, they only put a little bit in the front, a little bit in the back, and it's very long, a little bit in the front on the 2 sides, and it's long in the back. It probably would be a good idea that when you put your talus on, that you put a little longer in the front. And so it's not as long in the back, so there's somewhat mechuven connected each other. That certainly wouldn't hurt. That's what the Ramah says you need. You need 2 corners in the front, 2 corners in the back, mechuven connected each other. I don't think you have to sit there getting it exact, but if you only put it over a little bit in the front and it's a whole long talus in the back, so there could be like 3 or 4 feet between the corners, it's probably better to put a little more in the front and make it somewhat more mechuven. That concludes Siman Yud, and Mitzvah Hashem. Next year we'll begin Siman Yud Alef.